So after the election in the United States, I started looking around for information as to what had happened, and I kept finding that Facebook and other platforms were responsible for the outcome of the election. So as a social media researcher, I wanted to look and see how this had come to be and how these rumors had started in terms of making Facebook accountable and responsible for the results of not just the US election, but also the Brexit result. So in my research, I started to see some troubling things, and fake news lists were being circulated around. One of them had a list of 117 news sites that I took and I indexed. I pulled the links from those sites to make what they call a network graph. So the network graphs have the ability to show patterns in the structure and the patterns in how these sites are linked together. So rather than look at content and rather than look at the stories and the headlines, what I wanted to look at was the structural issues that were involved in this new media ecosystem, specifically for politics. So in my series, which I named Welcome to Fake News, modeled after the Apple app, the iOS app, when I was looking around, there's a lot of different things that make up fake news. So fake news is not a word that I feel is best for what's happening right now. I think that fake news is something that is a way to describe the effects of what we are seeing right now for journalism, for politics, for news coverage of controversial issues. So rather than look at fake news, which has been defined by an organization called First Draft as these different types of information, misinformation, misleading headlines and stories that don't match the headlines, hoaxes that try to bring people in, clickbait. So these types of sites and these types of efforts to manipulate and deceive are extremely important. So there's a lot of organizations that are working on fact-checking, and they're working on ways to look at stories, to look at the factual elements, and to see the content. What I was most interested in is looking at the structure. So when this kind of situation started to become more extreme, around the time there was a White House press briefing, and the President of the United States actually referred to one of the major news organizations in the country as, quote, "You are fake news." So this really is a point where I think that fake news became not just real news, but it became a way to frame and to weaponize a word to invalidate the reporting and the efforts of news organizations to hold politicians accountable for their actions. So this is the time when fake news I felt became a real issue. So around this time, there was also an article about people writing fake news content on Facebook. So I also looked at this, and going back and looking at the sources and seeing where the traffic into these fake news sites was coming, I started to realize that only approximately half of the traffic to these very fake news sites, so the sites that are very propaganda, hyper-biased, viral hoaxing, I started to see that a lot of the traffic was coming from unpaid search. So not through advertising, not through social media, but through things like direct links, which kind of suggested that some of this traffic into these fake news sites was coming from direct messaging, so DMs, text messages, SMS, organic search. And when I started to look at this, I took that list of 117 fake news sites, and I made a network of it. So it's hard to see on here. This is a tough image to present, but it really frames the ecosystem and shows, for once, I think, a visual idea or a visual representation of how this system and how this is set up. So I think that as researchers, we need to look at new ways to communicate to the public the scale of this problem. I mean, and this is only 117 sites. If you look into this, I saw that YouTube is kind of at the center of the fake news universe. And this is increasingly becoming a really interesting issue. So these smaller sites, and you can see it on the red outliers, they link to thousands of other sites, fake news sites, they link to blogs, they link to Twitter profiles, and they're kind of surrounding the rest of the, what you would call the mainstream media, or the kind of regular media. So if you zoom in on some of these, what you'll start to see is that you see that actors like YouTube are positioned directly next to what I would call community information resources. One of those would be Wikipedia. So, and you can see that a lot of the propaganda actors, I would call them, RT.com, Zero Hedge, these are major actors in terms of pushing out certain types of propaganda, including state-sponsored news. But they're matching up very close on the network to things like Wikipedia. So it almost suggests, like through a structural relationship, that information from places like WikiLeaks is starting to migrate into shared information resources, the things that we use to find facts, the things that we use to understand issues and events and people. So I find this very concerning in terms of how this is changing. So there's also newer forms of Wikipedia kind of setting up on the political extreme. So one of them was called Conservapedia. So there's a new breed of websites, and specifically focused on information and providing a resource for people to fact check, but almost like a left and right Wikipedia. The map also shows how people follow. So when you look at a very powerful Twitter account, I would say it's arguably the most influential Twitter account that exists right now. It's Real Donald Trump. You can start to see the kind of clusters of how they link to these specific sites or profiles, and how these are involved with some of the advertising infrastructure that's built into the internet. So you can see that networkadvertising.org is directly on the other side of a kind of big group of followers, including Facebook pages and web pages and websites and blogs to Real Donald Trump. So I think that one of the components of propaganda, and I would call this micropropaganda is what I've termed it, is really a lot of it is about targeting and also about capturing people's emotions and using these emotions and using the reactions that we post on social media as something that gives more data to companies that in turn want to understand how people think and how they might vote and how they make decisions in their life. So I think this, a lot of the point of fake news isn't just about putting out propaganda or fake information or false news, as Facebook is now calling it, but as much of these sites are about capturing and tracking behavior, and this is kind of a new area. So as we look through these fake news problems, this is a recent example of when CNN, there was an interview with Bernie Sanders, was one of the candidates for president, and you can see directly oppositional, when I typed in fake news on just a regular Google search, you can see that one story on the left says CNN didn't cut him off for fake news, and on the very right, you have the exact opposite. You say CNN cuts out Bernie Sanders after he makes fake news comments. So I find this, in terms of using resources like Google and other search engines, this is a problematic area. And one of the things that we can look at is how social media and how networks of bots, I would call them bots, are influencing trends and trending topics, which in turn influence what they would call instant predictions on Google, or autocomplete, some people call it. So this is a network of what I would argue were the most influential bots in the United States during the last week of the election. And you can kind of see it's like a megaphone. It's an amplification system, because it's these automated Twitter accounts and automated Facebook accounts are they're connected to each other. And the broadcast reach is enormous. So one of these accounts on one day had 31 million impressions. So that would roughly translate to 31 million views, which is just astounding. How many of those views are actually human, I guess, would be a different story, because we don't know how many automated accounts are connected to these. So one of the most surprising things about finding this type of activity and this type of coordination to help push out what would include fake news, but also other types of propaganda and other types of information. One of the most alarming things is that existing users are now being targeted and recruited into what they would call kind of hashtag activism groups and other types of political online groups. So when you look for bots and you see accounts that have been around since 2010 or 2000, years, and they seem automated, what you start to find, or through my research, what we've started to find is that these accounts have been built and set up to schedule and broadcast tweets from central locations. So they have these people log in or authenticate with their Twitter to sign in through Facebook or sign in through Twitter. Once that happens, their account becomes almost a clone. It can push out content at any time, and most of these accounts are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They never stop tweeting. So the other part of this that relates to this kind of amplification of certain topics, here's an example from Facebook, and this is from a Facebook search on Brexit. And this is one of the top results. So this isn't a sponsored post. This would be called an organic post. And you can see the kinds of messages and the kinds of framing they're putting out on certain news topics. So this was one of my parts of my evidence that actually got me started on pulling the information from these other fake news sites, because I started to see how these sites are coming to Facebook. So this isn't something that is being posted just on Facebook. The site that is associated with this is, I would call, one of the biggest propaganda actors. It's called TruthFeed. So how do we make sense of fake news when all of our resources are becoming almost polluted with the types of information that's being pushed out from huge Twitter bot networks, from Facebook algorithms, from cycles of attention that are reinforced through people's page views and through the number of likes or number of retweets that people end up getting? Here's an example of a fake story that went around, and it was a quote from Donald Trump saying that he basically says that Republicans are the dumbest group of voters in the country. So there was rumors that the Democrats or someone on the Democratic side had actually pushed this out. It took a few minutes for me to find, even as a researcher, it took me a few minutes to find out if this was real or not. So most people wouldn't really take the effort or time to kind of track this back and see if these types of things are real. They would see it on Facebook, it might be embedded in their feed, and it would kind of go from there. So looking at all of these mechanisms of fake news, going back to YouTube, which was one of the biggest actors in that big map that I showed, the ecosystem of fake news. Here's another example. Using that map from YouTube and looking at the structure and the connections of those actors that exist in the fake news network, I traced one of the links back to 80,000 fake YouTube videos. So there were 80,000 videos being put up by essentially the same organization. They were being created, they claimed, through artificial intelligence, and they were going up every 3 or 4 minutes, a new video. So, and what it would do, what these systems do is it would go and pull news. It would pull news from other websites and put it together and then speak it out in a computer voice, almost like Siri. So, and then they would just upload hundreds, if not thousands, of fake news videos. So, going back to how do we solve this? Are there any solutions to dealing with this? One of the things is understanding that the internet has, from the start, has been monetized through attention. It's been monetized through metrics like page views. We measure and we make money and we gauge the effectiveness of advertising on people's attention. So is there any way to move beyond that? I think that at some point there should be some type of system that is not based on people's time or eyeballs spent on a certain website or a certain page and clickbait and the types of ways that they use to promote news, especially a lot of newspapers that are having difficulty kind of maintaining readers. So the emotional element of this from an advertising and targeting perspective, here's one of the best examples from this group of 117 fake news sites that I used, and it's it's a pop-up that as you visit the website, it says, would you like to see Hillary in prison? And to get past this, you have to click like to agree. So the infrastructure that this is set up has really made or amplified this fake news problem. And I think that as the public, we need to move past using tools, especially that track people and that target people across different mediums, especially through emotional components, like I showed. Click Hillary or click like if you want to see Hillary in prison. So this is another network of the exact same group of sites that I showed on the earlier picture, but this is the advertising. This is the advertising technology behind these sites. So these are the trackers that load onto your computer or your phone when you visit these sites. And I'm just trying to show the scale of this problem. So every time you visit one of these sites, you're visiting maybe 4 or 5 third parties. And this isn't unusual for the web, but I think that the way it's being used for politics needs to be clarified, and it needs to be understood much more, and companies need to be much more transparent about how they inform their users about the data that they give them and how they share personal information especially. So recommendations to kind of at least deal with this in the short term, deal with the fake news problem. One of them is Google Instant Predictions. I mean, I think that as members of the public, if we're searching for facts, if we're searching for truth, if we see something we don't agree with or we think might not be completely true, which is a lot of the point of propaganda, I would argue that Google Instant Predictions are not the thing that you really want. I mean, you want to kind of look for things and find truth on your own terms. So one of my recommendations to deal with this in the short term is to turn off instant prediction. Another one, which most people don't know about, it's recent, there's another setting in your search settings in Google called verbatim. So once you turn that off, it takes away the news vertical. So all those news articles that I showed about Bernie Sanders that were conflicting, it makes it like the old Google, essentially. So I think this is a huge step forward to getting back to kind of pure search results and not getting news headlines and embedded news stories while we're trying to find information on important things like politics. Thank you.